Hello everybody, thank you for having me. I'm overdressed, jet-lagged, and had a glass of wine. So if I say anything that doesn't make any sense, that's because of these things. However, if I do make sense, that's me. I'm not sure if I have much to contribute to the people here who do such admirable work on the issues that were just talked about. Israeli politics doesn't always assist you in your important work. What I'm going to try and do is to add as much information as possible and as accurate information as possible to your knowledge about Israeli politics in the assumption, and this assumption is often challenged, that more knowledge contributes to a better conversation. I'm not sure this is always true. I'm not sure it's true in all countries and all times, but this is the only thing I have to offer. More information about Israeli politics. We just had an election in Israel. This person here, Prime Minister Netanyahu, was charged with forming a new coalition. And unfortunately, I cannot tell you the outcome of this process. The deadline for Mr. Netanyahu to form his coalition is next Tuesday. I made sure to be in Israel, to be back in Israel by next Tuesday to witness the outcome. And what we have now are four basic options. He can form a coalition that will be very much like his previous coalition, only slightly smaller. There's an option that he will form a coalition of just 60 members. This will be a very tricky thing to handle, but it's possible, at least in theory. There is a possibility that he will fail to form a coalition, and then again, we have two options. One is for someone else to get a chance to form a coalition. The president can give someone else up to 28 days to form a coalition, someone other than Mr. Netanyahu, or we can go directly to another round of election. This never happened in Israel's history, which doesn't mean it could never happen in Israel's future. In the last 2 weeks, there was some talk about the possibility of having another round of election, and as I'll show you the number, you'll be able to see that there is some rationale behind such talk. It's not necessarily out of the question that Israel will go to another round of election. I don't think it's the most likely outcome for next week, but it's not an impossibility. Israeli politics could be quite simple. It's much simpler than American campus politics, or so I hope. And what I'm going to try and do, I have some slides to assist me. What I'm going to try and do is to explain what we had in the last couple of decades, years, months, and weeks. And this hopefully will somewhat clarify and simplify the overall picture of how Israeli politics is run in the current era. So let me begin. Yeah, it works. Let me begin by a short history lesson or history reminder. I'm sure that all of you are quite familiar with the history of Israel and the history of Israeli politics, but it is sometimes necessary to be reminded of the events that brought down previous Israeli governments. Israeli governments almost never, in fact never, reach the actual final date of the term. They never complete their terms. Not once in the history of Israel a government completed its term, but the reasons for governments' fall downs are different from time to time. So Ehud Barak went to the Camp David conference, hoping to make peace with the Palestinians, with Yasser Arafat. He lost his majority in the Knesset, and his coalition was brought down quite fast. He was effective prime minister for about a year and a half, and then for another half a year, he was a lame duck. Yitzhak Shamir in 1992 was brought down by his own coalition. People tend to misunderstand the process and to assume that it's often the opposition that brings down Israeli government. That's not quite true. It is usually the coalition that crumbles from within. For Shamir, the key event was his decision to agree to participate in the Madrid Peace Conference following the first Gulf War. He agreed to go to Madrid, and his own right-wing coalition, the most right-wing parties within his own coalition, decided to bring down his government. The result was, of course, the victory of the Yitzhak Rabin government and the peace process and the Oslo Accords. The right-wing governments who brought down Shamir had many years to regret their decision not to stick with him. Rabin was brought down in the mid-70s because of a crisis over Shabbat, over the observance of Shabbat. He allowed F-15 airplanes to land in Israel very close to Shabbat on Friday evening, and the religious parties decided to quit his coalition. Likud was victorious then and became for the first time the ruling party. Shimon Peres in 1996 just miscalculated. It was half a year after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and Peres thought that there is no way for him not to get elected after such tragedy. He was up for a surprise. The Israeli voters decided to elect Netanyahu rather than Shimon Peres. Ehud Olmert was brought down because of corruption charges and because of infighting within his own coalition. So why did the Netanyahu government ended its term? Mostly because of fatigue. The Netanyahu government was very stable. In fact, when Netanyahu was last elected in 2015, you might remember he formed a coalition of 61 members. And many people thought that this will be a short-lived coalition because you cannot really survive with 61 members. It proved to be one of the most stable coalitions in Israel's history. From 61, it went up to 67 when Avigdor Lieberman and his party decided to join in. And it survived for almost the full term, not really the full term. One of the longest serving governments in Israel's history. Okay. So now let's go to the election. What was the main topic of the last election? The main topic was basically between two camps. There were two camps or two blocks in this election. One bloc wanted to keep David Ben-Gurion as the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. The other camp decided that it's time to have another person as the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. If Netanyahu is successful in forming a new coalition, and we assume that there is a good chance that he will form a coalition, in early summer he will become the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. This will be his fifth term as prime minister. He served one term in the mid-90s, was not a successful prime minister in the mid-90s. In fact, he was a failure. and we don't remember the enormity of his failure only because Ehud Barak was even a greater failure following Netanyahu. But Netanyahu managed to make a comeback and then get re-elected time and again by Israeli voters. So the main dilemma for Israeli voters in this last election was whether they want Netanyahu to continue as prime minister or not. What were the main ideological questions at hand? Netanyahu had a main rival, General Benny Gantz, from the Kahol Lavan, Blue and White Party. Blue and White is not really a party, it's an amalgamation of three different factions that joined together, did not even merge. They joined together to try and topple Prime Minister Netanyahu, to form a party or a bloc large enough to bring him down. And the ideological differences between these two blocs, one must say, are quite slim. On the economy, they have similar notions, similar sentiments. On the state and religion issues, there are some differences because we know that Netanyahu's base relies on a majority that is that includes the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties, and the Zionist religious parties. But it's clear that for Gantz to have any prospect of forming a coalition, he would also have to go with the ultra-Orthodox parties. So it's not clear that his policies would be different than Netanyahu's. And on foreign policy and the peace process, both leaders basically said it's irrelevant, there is no peace process, and they don't see any prospect for any peace process with the Palestinians in the near future. And the other issues such as Syria, the threat from Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc., these leaders basically agree. So the bottom line is that the two leaders and the two parties propose to Israelis very similar policies by using different language or different tone or different rhetoric. The differences were more in style than in ideological essence. What were the advantages and disadvantages that Netanyahu brought with him to the table? He has the experience, he has the world stage, he's well known around the world, and Israelis are well aware of that. They see him with President Trump, but not just with President Trump, but also with Vladimir Putin of Russia. They see him meet with the leaders of China. They see him meet with the leaders of India and bringing them to visits in Israel. So they see international stature, but most and everything what Israeli voters had in mind when they elected Netanyahu is 10 years of relative stability and success. There are many people in Israel who dislike Netanyahu. There are many reasons to criticize Netanyahu and to think that he might not be the right leader for yet another term, but it's hard to deny that the last 10 years were quite good for Israelis. Economically speaking, the country is growing, the economy is booming, Israelis feel relatively safe, relatively secure, they thrive, and they have a few reasons to complain. I just completed a survey in Israel a few weeks ago in which we ask Israelis every year if they feel comfortable living in Israel, both Jews and Arabs. And we've been doing this for 5 years at the Jewish People Policy Institute, and the numbers grow from year to year for the last 5 years. So even though we do hear a lot of complaints from Israelis and a lot of harsh political rhetoric from Israel, when you ask Israelis about their situation, they feel quite good about Israel's situation. The reasons to get rid of Netanyahu: fatigue, he's been there for too long; corruption, we'll talk about it a little bit later; and his divisive politics. Netanyahu is a highly effective politician. He learned the most important lesson in his first not so good term as prime minister in the mid-90s. He learned that handling one's coalition is the most important part of being an effective leader. If you don't have a coalition, if you don't have the votes in the Knesset, you can do nothing. So Netanyahu, for the last 10 years, makes sure to keep his coalitions together and to keep his majorities intact. This, of course, many times it raises questions about his behavior and his politics and his way of handling these things. But for him, the most important issue is to keep the coalition, and if using divisive politics is what helps him do that, he will not shy away from denigrating other Israelis or other camps by way of gathering his troops and making them more combative and more ready for political fights. His rival, Benny Gantz, General Benny Gantz, what was his main argument? His fresh face, that's nice to have. He's a moderate. There are very few people who can say something against Benny Gantz. He infuriated very few people in his long career. He's a nice man. I know him. I met him more than once when I was chief U.S. correspondent for Haaretz Daily about 10 years ago. He was the military attaché in Washington, so we had some opportunities to sit and talk. He's really a very nice man. It's hard to dislike him. He's civil. He has security experience. What are his main deficiencies? He has no political experience, and as I said, Netanyahu's main asset, the main reason for which he's able to be a leader for so many years, is that he mastered the political system and he's such an experienced politician. And his positions, the positions of Benny Gantz, were incoherent. He did not come to the table with any new agenda or new suggestion or new prescription for future policies. What he basically had is a Me Too kind of policy proposals. I'll do the same thing that they do, only better, or only with more politeness. These are the results, and I must apologize. Just this morning I realized that Shas and United Torah Judaism switched. So the numbers of Shas are really those of UTJ. It's not that important. You see that two parties, Likud and Blue and White, got a vast majority of the vote, more than 1 million votes for each party. And the two Haredi parties, ultra-Orthodox parties, have more than 500,000 votes together. And then you have the other parties by order, including the three parties that did not cross the electoral threshold. The New Right, with almost 140,000 votes thrown away. Zehut, with more than 100,000 votes thrown away. And Gesher, with almost 75,000. You do have to take into account, and this will come back later in the presentation, these three parties have mostly right-wing voters. So what you see here are more than 250,000 right-wing voters whose votes were cast for parties that did not pass the electoral threshold. These are the percentages of the parties. Again, switch Shas and United Torah Judaism. You see that the New Right with 3.2% of the vote, the electoral threshold is 3.25. So what separates the new right and from the Knesset is about 2,000 votes. That's it. That's a 4-seat difference between them and, for them to enter the Knesset and have 4 seats, all they needed is 2,000 votes. That's very significant. And you have to remember that the threshold was raised not for this last election, but for the previous election by a right-wing government. The Netanyahu government initiated the raise in the electoral threshold, believing that this will hurt the left. What happened, in fact, is that in the last election, the Arab parties, whom the right believed will not cross the threshold, got representation more significant than ever, with 13 seats in the Knesset. And what happened this time is that at least one party that was supposed to become part of the current coalition did not cross the threshold. So this initiative by a right-wing government to raise the threshold came back to haunt it or to bite it in 2 consecutive elections. This is the allocations of seats in the coming Knesset. As you can see, Likud and Blue and White will have 70 seats together. If they had the will to form a unity government for this coming term, they could easily do whatever they want in the Knesset with a 70-seat majority. That's very significant. But as I'm sure you're aware, the leaders of Blue and White committed themselves not to join a coalition led by Netanyahu because of the corruption charges against him. And Netanyahu also promised not to join a coalition with Blue and White because he's committed to his base coalition, his coalition with the right wing and the religious parties. Netanyahu doesn't only think about the current term. He thinks in advance on the next 10 years in which he wants to spend his time as prime minister. And for him to remain the prime minister of Israel, the most important thing is to keep his base together. That is, never to betray the base and go with the rivals in a unity government, but always to prefer a narrower government that is based on his core coalition of right-wing and religious parties. This is the voting percentage. What we had this year is pretty similar to the last couple of rounds of election. Israel used to have a higher percentage of voting in previous decades, but it went down. It went down, by the way, when Israel initiated direct vote for prime minister in the mid-90s. It was decided in Israel that Israel needed something more similar to the American system when the leader is elected directly by the voters. For 3 times we had elections in which the prime minister was elected directly and the parties separately, and since then we had a lower participation in Israeli elections. Was Netanyahu's victory or the right-wing victory a surprise? The simple answer to this question is no. No serious reader of polls and Israeli realities ever thought that Benny Gantz had any chance of forming the next Israeli coalition. This is the 60-seat line. These are all the polls of the last year. We all know from past experience that the polls tend to be more negative to the right than the actual outcome. They tend to give us a somewhat false picture that gives the right less mandates or less seats than it actually gets. Even then, you can see that for most of the time, the Netanyahu camp was above the 60 line. Moreover, it's important to note, and I'll show you immediately why, there was never a time in which you could see a Gantz coalition above the 60 threshold. There was never a situation in which we could envision a coalition formed by Benny Gantz in which there will be more than 60 members of Knesset. So a realistic reading of the polls and the situation was very clear all along that Netanyahu is the only realistic candidate to become Prime Minister of Israel. What did we have that didn't matter in this last election? And this is significant. I already showed you that ideological differences did not have much impact on Israel's elections. These are three important issues that people expected to have impact on the Israeli electorate and basically had no impact. The situation in Gaza. It's been going on for almost 15 years now, since the pullout of Gaza in 2005. Israel had to fight time and again on the Gaza border. 10 years under Netanyahu, Israel fought time and again near the Gaza border. There is no feasible remedy for this situation. And even during the round of election, there were eruptions of violence near the border. Still, Israeli voters did not punish the Netanyahu government for the situation in Gaza. They did not see Netanyahu and his coalition as failing to resolve this situation. They do not see a way for the government to really deal with this issue in a way that's better than what they do now. Second issue, corruption. It was expected, mostly by the media, that when Israel's Attorney General Mandelblit will release or will make public his decision to indict Prime Minister Netanyahu, this could have huge impact on the Israeli electorate. The decision to indict came and went. Israeli voters were not at all impressed by this decision. There was a lot of noise, again, a lot of media coverage and hype, but the polls didn't really move. We could see that the coalition or the number of people intending to vote for the current coalition is fairly stable. Last item, political maneuvering. There was a lot of it in the last round. The Labour Party basically disintegrated during this election cycle. Tzipi Livni ended her long career in politics. A new party was formed, Blue and White, to fight against Netanyahu, with famous generals heading it, with all kinds of important participants trying to shake up the Israeli system. But all this political maneuvering did not much change the Israeli scene. I will soon show you some numbers that will prove this point. Yeah, this is wonderful. So why don't we see a change in Israel's politics? Here I begin the serious part of the conversation. Why is Israel voting the way it does? The answer is because this is where the voters are. These are the numbers. It doesn't get to 100% because there are some people who won't answer or don't know. But this is the basic picture of Israel's political, ideological map. You often hear stories about Israel's left and right, as if there is a huge battle waged between a left and a right in Israel. This is a false dichotomy and a false narrative. There is no competition between left and right in Israel. The left in Israel in recent decades was marginalized to the extent that it barely exists. What you see here is 9% on the left plus 11 at the center left. And you ought to consider that some of it, or a lot of it, are Arab Israelis. We must talk a little bit about Arab Israelis. Arab Israelis basically do not play the Israeli political game. They participate in elections, they have representatives in the Knesset, but they do not play the game in the sense that they would never join an Israeli coalition, and hence they have no impact on the outcome of Israeli elections, because everybody knows they're out. They should not be counted within one of the main blocks because they always remain on the sidelines. The last time the Arabs played any role in Israeli politics was in the early 90s in the Rabin government when he needed to pass the Oslo Accords. Arab representatives supported him from the outside. They did not join in into his coalition. They supported him from the outside. Since then, it became completely impossible for any Israeli coalition to form based on the support of Arab parties, and the Arabs do not play the game. So this is the picture, and it's even more okay, that's bad. Okay. Even more important, yeah. Okay. Since we said the Arabs aren't playing the game, this is the map of ideological differences between Jewish Israelis, the people who do play the political game. And here you see that the left and the center left combined is 16%. The left itself is 5%. So next time you read a story in one of the great newspapers for which I sometimes write, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, when next time you read a story about Israel's left and right, remember that the right is an elephant and the left is barely, make your choice, a small cat that can meow from time to time. The right wing, 60% of Jewish Israelis define themselves as right or center right, 23% on the center. The left, again, barely exists, and that's where the political game is played. So what do we have when we talk about camps? As I said, right and left does not really describe it. What I consider to be a more accurate description of the political map has 5 main factions. The Arabs, who do not play the game. The center left, the left that barely plays the game, and the center left tries to but barely succeeds. The center and blue and white is a centrist party. It was never a center-left party. Moshe Ya'alon is a former defense minister for Likud. There was a former cabinet secretary that is one of the most important people in the party. There is a former spokesperson for Netanyahu who is a member of this party. This is not a left-wing party. It's a centrist party. Then you have the right wing and you have the religious party. And of course, in some cases, it's hard to define where parties exactly stand. Whether Kulanu is a centrist party or a right-wing party, whether the United Right is more right or more religious. It's very right. It's also very religious. You decide whether you want it to be counted on this camp or that camp. Last point, maybe I should have used it earlier, but this is again about Arab participation. These are voting percentages for all Israelis versus Arab Israelis. It is interesting to note that in the last election, for the first time, less than 50% of Arab Israelis bothered to even vote in this election. Of course, this is a troubling development, but I think in many aspects, it is because the Arabs don't play the game. There's no point in going to the polls if you already know that the parties for which you vote aren't going to play any role in a coalition or an opposition or a government, aren't going to use their leverage to better your situation. So if the parties for which you vote do not really play the game, and the parties that play the game don't really want you as a voter because they think that relying on Arab voters or Arab support could make them illegitimate in the eyes of other voters, then a reasonable choice is to stay home. And we see that the numbers for Arab voters are going down for the last decade and a half or 2 decades. And in the last election, again, it's a troubling development. Less than half of them bothered to vote. Ignore my misspelling of center and look at the left. These are numbers from Tel Aviv. I live in Tel Aviv, in northeastern Tel Aviv. I have 2 dogs, and when I go to the dog part every night, everybody there is a left-wing voter. Tel Aviv is the hub of the left. This is the state within a state. Some people, from time to time, we hear declarations, the state of Tel Aviv is going to establish itself as a counter state to the state of Israel. So this should be a place in which the left is much stronger than anywhere else. And it is stronger. It's 19%. Again, for Jews in Israel, it's 5%. In Tel Aviv, look at these 3 numbers. From the mid-90s, at the high days of the Oslo Accords, after the assassination of Rabin, almost half of all Tel Avivians voted for left-wing parties. It went down to a quarter in 2009, and now it's less than 1/5 in Tel Aviv voting for the left. So again, this narrative of right and left, it no longer holds, not even in Tel Aviv. As for the right, since the left is shrinking and is on the verge of disappearing, all we are left with is the fight for the right. Who's more right than the other right? In the last election, we had the new right, we had the, why do I need to click so many times? We had the sane right, we had the strong right, and we had the united right. At least 4 parties fighting to be the true representatives of the right. Why? Because the right is the main game in town. Now, one of the main problems that Prime Minister Netanyahu faces today is because of this competition. The right became so overconfident, so cocky about its prospects that it no longer managed to keep its unity. Too many people thought that they could form yet another right-wing party and still have enough votes to get into the Knesset. The new right was the victim of such cockiness, And Netanyahu is the victim of such cockiness, because without it, he would have 67 or 68 or 69 seats in the Knesset to play with and to maneuver with. But right now, all he has is 64 or 65, and he depends on each and every right-wing party if he wants to form a stable coalition. He has no room for maneuver because of this arrogance of the right, and because everybody thought that there are enough right-wing voters in Israel to support even more right-wing parties than we already have. Why do they have such arrogance? It's not completely irrational. This arrogance begins in the mid-70s. And look at these numbers. Look at this line. Since the mid-70s, if you count the votes of right-wing and religious voters, religious plus ultra-Orthodox plus Haredi voters, there is a clear majority of Israelis voting for this combination of right religious parties. You see the red-yellow line at the top. This graph is taken from a study by Professor Dan Ben David. I find it's very useful. When you look at this and you realize that we are living in such reality since the mid-70s, you realize, you understand why the right wing is so dominant in Israel, and you see why it makes so much sense for the right and the religious parties to join together and be the constant ruling coalition of Israel's system. What also makes sense, or why does it also make sense for the right and the religious parties to join together? That's because in Israel, religiosity or a sense of tradition and right-wing politics go hand in hand. Now, again, we have to go back in history and remember this was not always the case. The Zionist religious party, Mafdal, was a member of many labor led coalitions in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Haredi parties, ultra-Orthodox parties, sat together in center-left coalitions. They had no issue no problem sitting with the Labor Party. But this changed in the mid-70s, and religious voters became more right-wing than they used to be. Look at Haredi voters. Haredis are supposed to be non-Zionist. Why would they be so right-wing? Do they care about the land of Israel, the settlements? Apparently they do. Again, go back to the early 90s, to the Rabin government that signed the Oslo Accords. When was the Rabin government in trouble? After there were two Oslos, Oslo I and Oslo II. After Oslo I, the Haredi Shas party, that was a member of the Rabin coalition, could not withstand the pressure of voters and had to withdraw from the government. Since then, no Haredi party is ready to be a member, a reliable member of a centrist or center-left coalition. Ehud Barak tried it again in '99 with Shas, and they quickly left the coalition. They were members of his coalition for 8 or 9 months, and then they had to leave. Why did they have to leave? Because Haredi politicians also have voters, and their voters are right-wing voters. The leaders, even if the leaders are not so right-wing, even if the leader of Shas, Aryeh Deri, has some centrist, even leftist tendencies, he cannot go against the voters. He cannot join a government that his voters would not approve of. And as you can see, it's only secular voters in Israel. Only the totally secular voters in Israel tend leftward. All other voters are moving more and more to the right, the more traditional or the more religious they are. Just to demonstrate this, I put together a graph of support for the two-state solution. The blue line are secular voters. The yellow line are Haredi voters. So ultra-Orthodox Haredi voters in Israel who do not serve in the military, who traditionally or historically speaking are not members of the Gush Emunim, the settler movement, who theologically speaking have no reason to be right-wing. They have very little tendency to support a two-state solution. They are as right-wing as the most right-wing Zionist religious voters. That's why you see Haredi's parties teaming up with Likud and not with Labor or Blue and White or other centrist or left-wing parties. Click, click. Okay, some more numbers. These are Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this brings me to the question of, so what changed in the last election? And the answer is nothing. Nothing changed. We had Gaza, it did not matter. We had corruption, it did not matter. We had political maneuvering, it did not matter. These are Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the results from 2015 and 2019. Look at the similarities. It's basically the same numbers. And you can look at many other cities in Israel. I have the numbers for Beersheba, for Ashkelon, for many cities. It's basically, you see differences of maybe 1%, 2% here and there, but basically the same people voted for the same blocks. Not always for the same parties, but for the same blocks. Those who tended to vote for the right voted for the right. Those who tended to vote for the center-left voted for the center and the left. The result is that we basically have a repetition of the last election with one caveat. 2,000 voters that are missing to pass the new right beyond the threshold. If you had these 2,000 voters voting for the new right, you'd have almost the exact same coalition. It would be even slightly larger, 69 rather than 67 seats in the Knesset. It's the same results, and it's the same results because it's the same voters doing time and again the same thing. All the maneuvering, all the hype, people moving from one party to the other, they are moving within the blocks. They are not moving from one coalition to a different coalition, and that's why what we see is so stable. That's why Netanyahu is keeping the country politically stable for the last 10 years, because the voters never changed their minds. They might vote for Shas or for Likud because they know that either way, these parties will support Netanyahu as prime minister. They will not move from Likud to Blue and White or from Shas to Labor. They will not move in a way that will change the ultimate outcome of the election. Stability. Stability is important in politics. Here's one outcome or one manifestation of stability. These are all the leaders of the Likud party since the mid-80s. These are the leaders of the Labor Party since the mid-80s. That's the essence of stability. What you have in the Likud party is a sense of ownership, is a sense of success. they do not feel the need to replace their leaders. 3 leaders for 30 years? 3 leaders. Look at the number of leaders that the Labor Party had, and Gabay is not going to stay the leader for another term. He will be replaced, so you can already make some room for the next leader of the Labor Party. They are now talking about General Yair Golan as a possible candidate to be the next leader of the Labor Party. When you see so much movement on the opposition side, you understand that something isn't working. There's not enough substance, there's not enough sense of coherence on the center left, and that's why they cannot produce leadership that can compete with the Likud party for the last 30 years or so. I'm now going to contradict myself. Because politics is anything but coherent. We are talking about politics. So I've been talking a lot about Israel being a country of right-wing voters. And it's true. It's a country dominated by the right. But it is also a country that has a very large center. If you consider the Likud party a center-right party, and Blue and White a center-left party, and Kulanu a centrist party, and Gesher a centrist party, you realize that in the last election, most Israeli voters went for parties that are well within the center or the mainstream center of Israeli politics. Of course, some voters voted for more radical parties, for parties more in the margins, but the majority of Israelis voted for mainstream parties because while Israel is voting for right-wing coalitions, these are center-right coalitions with a majority of the voters in the center. And now I'm going to complicate this a little bit. We will not have much time to talk about these graphs. They are taken from this work, my last book. We might have an opportunity to talk about it a little bit tomorrow. It's a book about Israeli Judaism. And to produce this book, I teamed up with a pollster, a well-known Israeli pollster and statistician, Professor Camille Fuchs from Tel Aviv University. He's the only pollster who got it right on election night this last round, so I'm very proud of him. And one of the things that we did, we established a mechanism or a statistical formulation by which to divide Israeli Jewish society based on 2 parameters, traditionality and nationality. This is based on 32 questions, some of which are about tradition and some about the sense of nationality. And what we found is that Israeli Jewish society is basically a society of what we call Jew-Israelis. It's a society of people who are basically traditional and national in their sense, in their identity. There are 3 minority groups of people who feel very Jewish but not very patriotic, or very patriotic but not very Jewish, or distanced from both Israel's patriotism and from Jewish tradition. But the majority of Israelis are over there in the Jew-Israeli corner, the upper right corner. You can see where the Jewish Israeli average is. But the political point to make here is this one. This is where the voters of parties are located when you apply this formulation to them. You can see that the game is played here. This is where the voters are. the voters of Likud, Jewish Home, Shas, Kulanu, Yesh Atid, which is now teamed with blue and white. Almost all parties compete in the same arena. They do not try to attract left-wing voters. Why? Because left-wing voters are very few and on the margins. Only United Torah Judaism tries to attract Ashkenazi Haredis because they're the only ones located in this area of the map. But when you see blue and white compete with Netanyahu, imitate his ideology, his policies, sometimes even his language, it's not because they necessarily think that he's right on everything. It's because this is where the voters are. You cannot speak the language that will alienate you from most Israeli voters, and Israeli Jewish voters are in this area. And basically, just to make it concrete, this area is the area of people who, let's say, both make Kiddush on Friday night and raise the Israeli flag on Independence Day. They are both traditional, not necessarily religious, but traditional and national in their sense or in their identity. This is where the voters are. This is where the parties are. They're not on the extreme. This is mainstream Israel today. This is again from the study I did with Camille Fuchs. Look at how important it is for me to be Jewish by party. And you can see that the more you move to the right, the more important it is for people that they are Jewish. Okay, this will be my last comment. I think it's almost time. Still have a minute. Assuming that there is a new Israeli coalition next week that is very similar to the last coalition, does this mean that the policies we are going to see are going to be the exact same policies of the previous government? My answer is not necessarily. We have to remember that time and again, Israeli government encountered surprises and hence had to also surprise the voters with moves that they did not expect. This is true for Ehud Barak, who was elected as prime minister to bring about peace with the Palestinians and ended his term in the first month of the second Intifada with a huge wave of violence between Israelis and Palestinians. This is true for Sharon, who was elected saying that Netzarim in the Gaza Strip is exactly like Tel Aviv, and ended up evacuating Netzarim and all the other settlements in the Gaza Strip. It's true for Rabin, who surprised us when he went to Oslo, and for Begin, who surprised us when he signed a peace agreement with Egypt, and even for Netanyahu, who was elected when Barack Obama was in office and everybody expected Hillary Clinton to be a repetition of Obama's 2 terms, and then was, in Netanyahu's case, pleasantly surprised to discover that there is a new regime in Washington that he can easily work with. So what's going to happen when it